The loudest victory I ever witnessed began with 96 brand new houses and one piece of paper nobody thought to read. I stood alone on the highest ridge of my family's ranch while applause echoed across the valley below. Bright blue balloons drifted above freshly paved streets. Children raced bicycles along spotless sidewalks, and dozens of families admired the houses they had worked so hard to buy. A brass band played cheerful music near the stone entrance monument as real estate agents shook hands with smiling homeowners. The air smelled of fresh asphalt, cut lumber, and newly planted grass still damp from the morning sprinklers. From where I stood, every rooftop reflected the warm Texas sun like polished glass. 96 homes, 96 finished driveways, 96 mailboxes waiting for their first letters. Everyone celebrated a successful new neighborhood. I was the only person there who knew the ground beneath every foundation still belonged to my family. My name is Nathan Brooks, and if you had driven past that neighborhood on opening day, you would have believed exactly what everyone else believed. The roads looked permanent. Decorative oak trees lined every street. Streetlights stood perfectly spaced along freshly poured sidewalks. Families carried moving boxes through front doors while children laughed in backyards that had never existed a year earlier. Nothing about the place looked unfinished. Nothing suggested that an invisible mistake had quietly followed every survey, every planning meeting, every engineering drawing, and every county filing until it became accepted as unquestioned truth. At the center of the celebration stood Rebecca Collins, the Homeowners Association president. Wearing a navy blazer and holding ceremonial scissors wrapped with blue ribbon, she proudly thanked contractors, engineers, county planners, architects, and board members for creating what she called one of the finest communities in the county. Cameras flashed as local reporters recorded every word. She smiled with complete confidence because every document she had ever reviewed told the same story. Looking across the valley through the old binoculars my father once carried during cattle inspections, I could see every detail without hearing a single speech. I watched families pose for photographs beneath the entrance sign. I watched landscaping crews finish the final flower beds. I watched moving trucks pull away from houses that still smelled like fresh paint. Most of all, I watched people unknowingly celebrate on land whose true history had never disappeared. It had simply been forgotten beneath newer paperwork. My father used to tell me that land never lies, but people often stop asking the right questions. When I was young, I thought he meant learning how to repair fences or recognize changing weather. Years later, I realized he was talking about records, boundaries, and patience. Long before anyone imagined building a neighborhood there, my grandfather had walked every acre beside licensed surveyors carrying steel measuring chains. Long before paved streets crossed those rolling fields, limestone markers and survey pins quietly marked the same legal boundaries that still existed beneath the grass. Those markers had survived storms, droughts, and generations of ranch work. They never moved. Only the paperwork surrounding them slowly drifted away from the truth. I had spent nearly 3 years quietly collecting certified copies of public records while construction advanced one careful step at a time. Every subdivision plat, every planning commission minute, every engineering revision, every county permit, every recorded survey, every tax map. They filled cabinet after cabinet inside my study while one object remained untouched inside the old fireproof safe my father left behind. I had not opened it since the day we buried him because he always said there would come a moment when the oldest paper in the room would become the most valuable. Standing on that ridge as the ribbon finally fell and applause filled the afternoon air, I understood that moment had arrived, and nobody below had any idea that the celebration they would remember forever was only the beginning of a story the original deed had been waiting decades to finish. The morning after the grand opening, I drove my old pickup along the gravel ranch road that my grandfather had carved into the hillside more than 50 years earlier. Dawn spread slowly across the rolling Texas pasture, turning the dew on the tall grass into thousands of tiny points of light. The neighborhood looked peaceful from a distance. Porch lights switched off one by one as families prepared for work, garage doors opened, and children waited patiently beside brand-new sidewalks for the school bus. Watching those ordinary moments reminded me of something important. None of those families had created the mistake that brought all of us to this point. They had trusted builders, engineers, surveyors, title companies, and official county records exactly the way any reasonable person would have done. My disagreement was never with the people living there. My responsibility was to protect the land my family had cared for long before any subdivision existed. My great-grandfather purchased the original ranch when most of the county was open grazing land connected only by dirt roads and barbed wire fences. My grandfather slowly expanded the property over several decades, recording every purchase with the county recorder and personally walking every surveyed boundary beside licensed surveyors carrying steel measuring chains. My father inherited those same habits. Every spring he inspected the limestone boundary markers after heavy rains. Every summer he searched for the old survey pins hidden beneath growing grass. Every autumn he compared tax records against county maps, because he believed ownership was something a person actively protected rather than simply assumed. As a teenager, I often followed him across the ranch carrying measuring tape, fence tools, and water bottles, wondering why he cared so much about stones that never seemed to move. He would simply smile and point toward the eastern ridge before repeating the same sentence every single year. The land stays exactly where it belongs. Only paperwork and people lose their way. At the time I laughed because the boundary seemed obvious. The creek flowed through the same shallow valley. The windmill stood beside the same cattle pond. The old oak trees cast their shadows across the same pasture every afternoon. Everything looked permanent. Years later, I finally understood what he had been trying to teach me. Physical landmarks rarely create legal disputes. Records do. After finishing my fence inspection that morning, I parked beside the weathered limestone marker marking the eastern boundary and knelt beside a rusted survey pin almost completely hidden beneath wild grass. I brushed away the dirt until the metal cap became visible again, then photographed it from several angles before comparing its location with a certified survey copy resting inside my truck. Every measurement matched perfectly. The pin had remained exactly where it had always been. Looking beyond the pasture toward rows of identical rooftops reflecting the early morning sun, I realized the neighborhood had not been built because the land changed. It had been built because one mistaken legal description had quietly traveled through years of copied documents until everyone accepted it without tracing the chain of title back to its beginning. Before driving home, I stood silently beside the old boundary marker for several minutes while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the ranch. My father's words echoed in my mind once again, and for the first time I realized that protecting our family's history no longer meant simply maintaining fences or repairing gates. It meant making certain the original truth recorded decades earlier would finally be read by the people who mattered most. Construction seemed to accelerate with every passing month, almost as if the entire county had quietly agreed that the neighborhood already belonged exactly where it stood. Every few weeks another section of road opened, another row of foundations appeared, and another collection of rooftops rose above the rolling pasture that my family had known for generations. From the ridge overlooking the valley, I watched bulldozers reshape gentle hills into perfectly graded streets, while concrete trucks arrived before sunrise and framing crews worked beneath the hot Texas sky until the last light faded beyond the western horizon. Utility companies buried water lines, electrical conduits, natural gas pipes, and fiber optic cables beneath freshly compacted roads, creating the appearance of permanence one careful step at a time. Most people assumed that construction itself proved ownership. I knew better. Concrete does not change a deed, and a street sign does not rewrite county records. While the neighborhood continued growing, I quietly built something of my own inside the study of the old ranch house. Every planning commission agenda, every engineering revision, every environmental review, every subdivision plat, every recorded survey, every county permit, every zoning approval, every tax assessment, and every publicly available filing found its place inside neatly labeled archival folders. Week after week, the filing cabinets became heavier while the neighborhood became larger. Friends occasionally asked why I never confronted the developer or demanded that construction stop immediately. My attorney answered that question long before anyone else asked it. He explained that rushing into court before the complete chain of public records existed would likely create years of unnecessary procedural disputes, while the same inaccurate legal description continued circulating through incomplete documentation. Waiting allowed every approval, every filing, and every engineering record to become part of one continuous documentary history that could later be examined in its entirety beside the original deed. His advice never encouraged delay for its own sake. It encouraged patience so the evidence would eventually speak with complete clarity instead of fragmented arguments. That approach matched everything my father had taught me about the land. One rainy afternoon, after another subdivision map appeared in the county records, I unlocked the old fireproof safe for the first time in years. The heavy steel door opened with the familiar sound I remembered from childhood. Inside rested the weathered envelope my father always handled with extraordinary care. Beneath layers of protective paper lay the original recorded deed, a hand-drawn survey bearing the county seal, handwritten boundary notes prepared decades earlier by licensed surveyors, and photographs, showing the limestone markers exactly where they still stood across the ranch. I carefully unfolded each page beneath the warm desk lamp, comparing every handwritten measurement with the certified copies I had collected over the past 3 years. Every distance matched. Every bearing matched. Every reference point aligned perfectly with the original survey pins that remained hidden beneath the eastern pasture. Nothing in the historical record had changed. Only the newer paperwork had gradually drifted away from it. I returned every document to the protective envelope and closed the safe without showing anyone what rested inside. Outside the window, another construction crane slowly lowered roof trusses onto one of the final homes as the evening sun painted the entire neighborhood in shades of gold. Looking across the valley, I realized the builders were not constructing evidence against me. They were unknowingly completing the very sequence of public records that would allow the oldest document my family owned to explain the entire story exactly as it had been recorded generations before. Several days after I closed the fireproof safe, my attorney called just after sunrise and asked me to bring every certified record I had collected over the past 3 years. His voice remained calm, but I had worked with him long enough to recognize that something important had finally come together. I loaded 2 archive boxes into the back of my pickup and drove toward the county courthouse while morning fog drifted gently across the ranch. As I passed the eastern boundary, I slowed beside the familiar limestone marker, standing exactly where my grandfather had shown it to me decades earlier. The stone had survived storms, droughts, changing seasons, and generations of ranch work without moving an inch. Looking beyond it toward the completed neighborhood, I realized that the land itself had never created the dispute. Only the paperwork surrounding it had changed over time. Inside a courthouse conference room, large tables were covered with county plats, engineering drawings, historical surveys, aerial photographs, tax records, subdivision filings, and certified copies of every public document connected to the development. A licensed surveyor joined us carrying the completed GPS field measurements while a county records specialist arrived with archived files preserved inside climate-controlled storage beneath the courthouse. Nobody rushed the process. Every page was examined carefully before another document was added to the growing timeline. The surveyor projected a modern satellite image onto a large display before slowly layering historical surveys over present-day property lines. Current streets appeared first. Utility easements followed. Then the approved subdivision plat. Finally, the original survey attached to my family's recorded deed appeared across the screen. The room grew noticeably quieter. Every layer aligned until the eastern section reached the old ranch boundary. There, decades earlier, one copied legal description had shifted slightly away from the original survey. By itself, the difference looked surprisingly small. Most people would never notice it without comparing every generation of records side by side. Yet over hundreds of acres, that single deviation gradually influenced every later engineering drawing, planning approval, and recorded plat. My attorney leaned forward while the county records specialist carefully compared recording dates and document references one final time. The conclusion remained consistent no matter which archive we examined. The earliest deed never changed. The original survey never changed. The chain of title remained uninterrupted through every generation of my family. Every later inconsistency traced back to one mistaken legal description that continued being copied without anyone returning to the original record preserved by the county. The surveyor signed his completed report and handed my attorney the certified GPS findings together with supporting measurements, boundary coordinates, and historical overlays. We immediately filed the updated survey with the county recorder, so the corrected analysis became part of the official public record before any legal proceedings began. Walking outside beneath the warm Texas afternoon sun, I watched ordinary people entering and leaving the courthouse without realizing that years of assumptions had quietly been replaced by verified history inside one conference room. Back at the ranch that evening, I placed the newly certified survey beside the weathered envelope resting inside the fireproof safe. For the first time since construction began, every piece of evidence belonged to one complete story. The original deed, the historical survey, the GPS measurements, the county archives, and the public records all pointed toward exactly the same conclusion. Nothing depended upon opinions anymore. From that moment forward, the documents would be allowed to speak for themselves. The formal notice from the court arrived less than 2 weeks later, printed on ordinary white paper that looked almost insignificant compared with the decades of history resting inside the leather document case beside my desk. My attorney called that afternoon and asked me to meet him one final time before the hearing so we could review every exhibit in the exact order the judge would see them. When I arrived at his office, the conference table held a carefully organized timeline beginning with my great-grandfather's original deed and ending with the certified GPS survey we had recently recorded with the county. Every page flowed naturally into the next. There were no missing links, no unexplained gaps, and no conflicting records. The historical survey connected perfectly with the boundary acknowledgement my father had preserved for years. The tax records matched the legal description. The county archives confirmed the recording dates. The modern GPS measurements aligned with the original limestone markers that still stood across the eastern ridge. Looking at the complete sequence together, I realized the strength of the case did not come from one dramatic document. It came from dozens of independent records quietly supporting the same truth across generations. My attorney explained that our responsibility in court would be surprisingly simple. We would not accuse anyone of acting with bad intentions because nothing in the evidence suggested that. Instead, we would demonstrate that every later planning document relied upon one mistaken legal description copied from an earlier filing without returning to the controlling historical record. That distinction mattered because the law recognizes recorded ownership through the chain of title rather than repeated assumptions. Before leaving his office, he carefully placed the original deed inside a protective archival sleeve and returned it to the leather document case. "The oldest document will not be the loudest exhibit," he said. "It will simply be the most reliable one." Driving back toward the ranch, I passed the completed neighborhood once again. Families worked in flower beds, children practiced basketball in driveways, and delivery trucks moved slowly through streets that had already become part of everyday life. Watching those familiar scenes strengthened my resolve to approach the hearing with patience instead of emotion. None of those homeowners had rewritten county records. They had trusted professionals who believed the paperwork was accurate. The legal process needed to respect that reality while also recognizing the historical ownership preserved by my family for generations. That evening, I unlocked the old fireproof safe once more beneath the photograph of my father. Alongside the original deed rested the handwritten survey, the boundary acknowledgement, and several faded photographs showing my grandfather standing beside the same limestone marker decades earlier. I studied each page quietly before placing everything back into the protective folder exactly as my father had taught me. When the heavy steel door closed, I no longer felt uncertainty about what would happen next. The evidence was complete, the historical record remained uninterrupted, and every certified document pointed toward the same conclusion. Whatever questions awaited inside the courtroom, the answers had already been preserved for generations by the land itself and by the people who understood that truth is strongest when it is carefully documented long before anyone realizes how important it will someday become. The courthouse felt unusually quiet on the morning of the hearing, as though every hallway understood that decades of recorded history were about to be examined one page at a time. My attorney and I arrived early, carrying only the leather document case that had remained beside my desk throughout the entire dispute. Across the courtroom, Rebecca Collins sat with the Homeowners Association legal team, several engineers, and representatives from the developer. Large binders filled their table, each containing approved subdivision plats, planning commission records, engineering reports, construction permits, inspection certificates, and every official document created during the development of the neighborhood. Looking around the room, I realized that everyone present believed they possessed the complete story. They simply possessed different chapters of it. When the hearing began, the association's attorney carefully explained the planning process from beginning to end. He described years of engineering reviews, environmental studies, zoning approvals, infrastructure planning, and county acceptance of every subdivision filing. Every statement matched the public records I had collected myself over the previous 3 years. My attorney never interrupted because our position did not depend upon challenging those documents. It depended upon placing them into their proper historical order. After the presentation concluded, the licensed surveyor stepped forward and displayed a series of layered maps across a large courtroom screen. Modern satellite imagery appeared first, followed by utility easements, engineering drawings, recorded subdivision plats, tax parcel maps, and finally the original survey attached to my family's deed. One transparent layer settled over another until the complete history became visible. The eastern boundary remained perfectly consistent throughout every historical record until one copied legal description introduced a slight deviation many years earlier. That small error continued from document to document because every later survey relied upon the previous filing instead of comparing it against the earliest recorded deed preserved in the county archives. The surveyor explained every coordinate, every reference point, and every field measurement using the certified GPS report filed only. Weeks before, the courtroom remained silent because nothing about the explanation depended upon opinions. Every conclusion could be independently verified by the documents themselves. My attorney then stood, opened the leather document case, and carefully removed the weathered archival folder my father had protected for so many years. Inside rested the original deed, the hand-drawn survey bearing the county seal, the historical boundary acknowledgement, and certified copies confirming an uninterrupted chain of title through every generation of my family. Each exhibit was presented in chronological order, allowing the judge to compare the oldest recorded ownership directly against every later planning document. Rebecca quietly reviewed the same exhibits while her legal team examined the recording dates and historical references. No raised voices interrupted the proceedings. No dramatic speeches filled the courtroom. Only decades of careful documentation speaking with remarkable consistency. By the time the final exhibit reached the bench, I could see the entire sequence unfolding exactly as my father once predicted. The oldest paper in the room had not become the loudest voice. It had simply become the one document every newer record would ultimately be measured against. And as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, I understood that patience had accomplished something urgency never could. The truth had been given the opportunity to introduce itself in the exact order history intended. The courtroom remained completely still as the judge carefully reviewed every exhibit one final time, comparing the original deed against the certified surveys, historical county archives, tax records, and the modern GPS report that had been entered into evidence. Every page was examined with deliberate patience, and every reference number, recording date, and legal description was checked against the next document in the chain. My attorney never attempted to dramatize the moment because the records already carried all the authority they needed. The licensed surveyor returned briefly to clarify one final technical question regarding the historical boundary. Markers, explaining that each original reference point still existed exactly where the earliest survey had placed it decades earlier. The county records specialist confirmed that the original deed had remained uninterrupted throughout every transfer within my family and had never been amended or replaced. One by one, every independent source continued pointing toward the same conclusion. Rebecca Collins sat quietly beside the Homeowners Association legal team, carefully reviewing the exhibits that only hours earlier she believed would support the development entirely. I could see the realization gradually settling across the table as every historical record aligned with the same property boundaries. There was no dramatic confrontation between us because none was necessary. The evidence itself had become the conversation. After a brief recess, the judge returned and carefully summarized the documentary history presented throughout the hearing. He explained that while the subdivision approvals, engineering plans, and county permits had all been processed through ordinary administrative procedures, those approvals depended upon legal descriptions that had been copied forward from an earlier filing rather than verified against the controlling historical deed. The court recognized that the original deed, supported by the historical survey, uninterrupted tax history, certified GPS measurements, and archived county records, established the legally controlling ownership of the disputed land. At the same time, the judge acknowledged that the families living in the completed neighborhood had purchased their homes in good faith and deserved a lawful resolution that protected their legitimate interests while respecting established property rights. Rather than treating the situation as a contest with winners and losers, the court directed every party to participate in a structured settlement process supervised through additional hearings. Licensed surveyors, county officials, title professionals, and legal counsel would work together to prepare corrected property records, evaluate appropriate easements, and develop legally recognized agreements consistent with the confirmed ownership findings. Listening from my seat, I thought about my father standing beside the old limestone marker years earlier, repeating the lesson I had never fully understood until now. The land had never changed. The records had simply needed to be read in the correct order. As the hearing concluded, Rebecca slowly gathered her binders before walking toward my attorney and me. She spoke quietly, acknowledging that every decision she had made had relied upon documents she believed were accurate, and she admitted she had never imagined the oldest record in the county archives would ultimately determine the outcome. I told her I never doubted that many people had acted honestly based upon the information available to them. That was precisely why the legal process existed, to separate long-standing assumptions from verified history. Walking out of the courthouse beneath the warm Texas afternoon sun, I carried the leather document case a little more lightly than I had when I arrived. The original deed rested safely inside, not as a weapon against anyone, but as the final piece of a historical record that had quietly waited through generations for the opportunity to tell the complete truth. Over the following weeks, the courtroom gave way to conference rooms, county offices, and long tables covered with maps instead of arguments. The judge had made one principle perfectly clear. The historical ownership had been established, but the solution now required cooperation rather than confrontation. That direction changed the tone of every meeting that followed. Licensed surveyors compared every recorded boundary against the original field notes, while title professionals reviewed thousands of pages of recorded instruments to determine exactly where each legal description had drifted away from the historical chain of title. County officials updated reference maps, engineers prepared revised easement proposals, and attorneys from every party worked through each document with remarkable care. For the first time since the neighborhood had appeared on my family's land, everyone inside the room was solving the same problem instead of defending different assumptions. Rebecca Collins attended every meeting. The confidence I had first seen during the neighborhood dedication had been replaced by careful attention to every page placed before her. She asked thoughtful questions about the original survey, the county recording process, and the historical boundary markers that my grandfather had helped preserve decades earlier. When the licensed surveyor displayed the layered maps once again, she quietly acknowledged that she had never imagined a single copied legal description could continue influencing later documents for so many years. No one criticized her for relying upon the records that existed at the time. Instead, the discussion focused entirely on restoring the public record so future generations would never inherit the same mistake. My attorney reminded everyone that the objective had always been clarity rather than conflict. That sentence seemed to settle the room every time difficult questions arose. The completed neighborhood remained a place where families had built ordinary lives, and nothing about those families deserved unnecessary uncertainty. Together, the legal teams explored practical solutions supported by the court's findings. Updated easement agreements were drafted where appropriate, corrected legal descriptions were prepared for county recording, and title professionals began coordinating revised documentation that accurately reflected both the confirmed ownership history and the legal interests recognized through the settlement process. Every correction required signatures, certifications, and independent review before becoming part of the permanent public record. Watching that process unfold reminded me of the way my father used to repair an old fence. He never rushed to replace every board at once. He corrected one section carefully before moving to the next because a lasting repair depended upon precision rather than speed. One afternoon, after another productive settlement session, I drove back to the ranch and stopped beside the familiar limestone boundary marker overlooking the neighborhood. Children played in neighborhood parks while families mowed lawns and waved to neighbors, beginning another ordinary evening. Looking across the valley, I felt no satisfaction in proving someone wrong. What mattered was knowing that the truth had finally become the foundation for every decision that followed. The original deed, the hand-drawn survey, the certified GPS measurements, and the county archives had not divided a community. They had given everyone the opportunity to rebuild certainty upon verified history. As the warm Texas breeze moved through the tall grass surrounding the old survey pin, I realized that patience had accomplished something far greater than a courtroom victory. It had allowed facts, fairness, and careful documentation to guide every step toward a lawful future where both the land and the people living upon it could finally move forward with confidence. Several months after the final settlement documents were recorded, I unlocked the fireproof safe one last time, not because another dispute had appeared, but because I wanted to return every page to the place where my father believed it belonged. The original deed rested beside the hand-drawn survey, the historical boundary acknowledgement, certified copies of the updated county records, and the final settlement documents that completed a story spanning generations. As I carefully organized the folder, I noticed how different the collection looked compared with the first time I opened the safe after my father's passing. The oldest papers had not changed at all. What changed was everything around them. The county maps now reflected the verified historical boundaries. Corrected legal descriptions had replaced the copied error that quietly traveled through years of administrative filings. Survey references now matched the original field notes. Future title searches would begin with accurate information instead of inherited assumptions. The historical record had finally become complete again. A few days later, I drove toward the eastern ridge before sunrise, parking beside the familiar limestone boundary marker that had silently watched every chapter of this story unfold. Morning light spread across the pasture while a gentle breeze moved through the tall grass surrounding the original survey pin. Beyond the ridge, the neighborhood had settled into ordinary life. Children waited for the school bus beneath young oak trees that had grown noticeably taller since the first dedication ceremony. Neighbors greeted one another while walking their dogs. Lawns had matured, flower beds were blooming, and front porches displayed seasonal decorations instead of moving boxes. Looking across the valley, I realized the place no longer represented conflict in my mind. It represented responsibility. Rebecca Collins eventually joined me there one quiet afternoon after the county completed its final recording updates. She stepped out of her vehicle carrying a folder containing the newly certified plats and smiled with a calm expression very different from the confidence she had displayed during the neighborhood celebration many months earlier. Without speeches or formal announcements, we walked together toward the old boundary marker. She handed me copies of the corrected public records before thanking me for approaching the dispute through patience instead of anger. I told her that every lesson my father taught me came down to one simple belief. Truth does not become stronger because someone argues louder. It becomes stronger because someone preserves it carefully enough for the next generation to find it. We shook hands beneath the warm Texas afternoon sun while the windmill slowly turned across the pasture exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Driving home, I looked once more across the land that had shaped 4 generations of my family. The ranch remained exactly where it had always been. The neighborhood continued growing with confidence because its future now rested upon accurate records instead of forgotten assumptions. The original deed returned to the fireproof safe that evening, not as a trophy and never as a weapon, but as a quiet reminder that history rewards those willing to protect it with patience, honesty, and careful documentation. My father was right all along. The land never forgot where it belonged. People simply needed to read its story from the very beginning before they could finally understand where every boundary truly started and where justice had patiently been waiting all those years.